The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone, good morning, good afternoon, good evening your time. Welcome to our first students webinar. My name is Francisca and here with me we have Katrina Yaret, our president of SPWLA. And we are really happy to welcome everyone to our first student webinar today and appreciate that you join us. So this webinar is actually intended as a platform for our students to share their great work for other students, not only for students, but also to all SPWA members, and as of course, as a platform for our students to shine. So yeah, our first one will have Judah Odiachi, the first winner of SPWA paper competitions from last year for master category. So, but yeah, before that, we fortunate again to have Katrina, and I will hand over Katrina for some of the opening remarks.
Thank you so much, Francisca, and welcome everybody again. It is an honor for me to help kick off this wonderful webinar series, like Francisca said, dedicated to our students, but beyond that, dedicated to give them a platform to spread out their voices a little bit further, because the ISPC is a great event, but it's usually in a smaller circle, and this platform again will give us another opportunity to collaborate and share their knowledge further. So I'm really excited about this, and I'm happy to have Judah kick this off, and hopefully to many more of these, and to many more discussions, leading to collaborations worldwide. So I appreciate everybody, and thanks again, everybody, for attending. Have a great one.
Thank you, Katarina. Thank you so much for the opening remark. So having further ado, we only have like 30 minutes. So let me just introduce our first speaker, which is the first students webinar speaker. So Judah Odiachi is the Gollier and McNaughton Graduate Fellow. He is currently pursuing a dual master degree in petroleum engineering and data science and analytics at the University of Oklahoma. Currently, he is a graduate research assistant at the Integrated Core Characterization Center, or IC3. His research is focused on tortuosity, enhanced oil recovery, and rock fluid interaction in shales. An SPWLA International Paper Contest first place winner, and he also has multiple awards winner. He also served as a VP of UOU SPWLA, or Oklahoma City SPWLA. He obtained his Bachelor of Science in Petroleum Engineering with first class honor from the University of Lagos, Nigeria in 2018, and during which he represents his institution in the international petroball competitions. So with that, I hand over to Judah.
Yeah. Thank you for this opportunity, and good day to everyone. My name is Judah Odiachi, and today I'll be giving a presentation on the determination of pore fluid salinity in porous media. So you might be wondering, why are we interested in determining pore fluid salinity? So here I'll be listing some of the various reasons. First of all, we know that salinity is a required input for water saturation calculations based on our resistivity and dielectric logs. With the salinity, we can go ahead to determine the resistivity values or resistivity parameters that go into our Archie's laws or various well log based equations in order to determine what saturation would be. We also know that saturation controls brine hydrogen index, and this is really important, especially when we're dealing with NMR applications in order to make porosity corrections whenever necessary. And thirdly, we know that salinity controls brine interactions in our rocks, brine rock interactions. So based on these, I will now be discussing about the current methods we have for determining salinity. So first of all, one of the methods we have is the analysis of produced water. So what this entails is that produced water is analyzed for its ionic constituents. or the conductivity of the produced water can be measured, and from there we can infer what the salinity would be. But then this particular method in itself has some limitations, some of which include: one, some wells do not produce water. And in the case where they do not produce water, there is no analysis for us to do. Another limitation is in the fact that there could be issues with the allocation of water. And what does this mean? This means that the zones where we have water collected from in the subsurface may not be our zones of interest. And so we'll be making a great deal of assumption that for our particular zone of interest, it's the same as where our water is gotten from. Secondly, we can determine salinity from the analysis of brine extracted from cores. It usually involves using techniques such as like centrifugation process, but this is it's complex, especially in shales. And then there are some limitations that this process presents. One of which is in tight rocks, we have very low water recovery. And in such cases, there is no analysis that can be done. The third method that I will be discussing is salt leaching. And salt leaching is a process that involves equilibrating DI water with dried samples. The DI water is then analyzed for its salt content. But in order to determine salinity from this method, there are still some limitations. And what are those limitations from this salt leaching method? It is that we need to have an idea of the porosity and saturation of the sample beforehand in order to make the calculations for what the salinity would be. So, due to the limitations that are involved in using some of these various techniques, research has gone into determining how we can understand salinity in porous media without fluid extraction using dielectric properties. Prior to this presentation, there were particularly two methods in literature that speaks about how dielectrics can be used, and I'll be giving a brief introduction as regarding them in subsequent slides. But before going into that, I would like to make like a brief introduction as to dielectrics for salinity determination. So on this slide, we see that the dielectric constant K is comprised of both a real part and an imaginary part. The real part is called the relative permittivity, and the imaginary part is called the dielectric loss. The relative permittivity is has a direct relationship with capacitance, and the dielectric loss has a direct relationship with the conductivity of the medium. So with this knowledge, let's now look at some of the methods in literature that use this dielectric approach. The first that we'll be considering is the Collab method for salinity determination. So what Collab did was that they developed something called the salinity index, which is a ratio of capacitance at different frequencies. And so based on this, in order to they developed a calibration curve that takes into the water resistivity as a function of salinity index. Now, this salinity index calibration line was determined by measuring barrier samples, barrier sandstone samples that were imbibed in brine of known resistivities. And from those measurements, they were able to build this calibration line. So basically, when you have like a new sample and you do the capacitance measurements on this new sample, from the salinity index, you can infer what the water resistivity would be. But then this particular method still has some limitations. And one of them is that in the fact that we see that the salinity index covers a very low range, that is from 1.9 to about 2.15. That's about 0.25 range, and that is for a salinity range of 2,000 ppm to 280,000 ppm. So the salinity index range is pretty low for the water resistivity values that we would be interested in. Another limitation we have is that by looking at this chart on the right, we see that if we want to infer salinity directly from water resistivity, there is a point at which we lose sensitivity in determining salinity just from water resistivity at around 100,000 ppm. We see that it pretty much flattens out. So this is another limitation that this method presents in determining salinity from the water resistivity. The next method that we have is the Chevron method for salinity determination. So Chevron developed this method based on the square root of the relative permittivity and the square root of the dielectric loss on brine of known concentrations to determine the calibration curve that is shown on the right here. So from the relative permittivity and dielectric loss values on brine, on bulk brine solutions, we can determine this calibration curve. Then what they go ahead to do is that they make measurements on barrier samples with different porosity and saturations, and that have been imbibed in these particular concentrations. And from there, based on the various measurements on the barrier samples, they can extrapolate to the calibration line to determine what is the saturation, as shown in this chart, for the various samples imbibed in different concentrations of brine. So what we see is that this is a good method, but it poses a limitation in the sense that you need a variation of porosity and the saturation in order to infer what this salinity would be. And this cannot really be applied to unconventional rocks, as changing porosity and saturation could lead to changing some other petrophysical parameters, such as mineralogy or TOC, that could affect our interpretation. So based on this, that leads to the objective of this presentation, which is to develop a novel methodology to measure brine salinity in porous media without fluid extraction. So here in this particular chart, we see how our dielectric measurements are conducted in our lab. We have a dielectric probe of which we place our sample under the probe, and then we make our dielectric measurements. On this particular chart, we see that we see the relationship between the relative permittivity and frequency for deionized water. We pretty much see that the experimental data closely agrees with literature published values of DI water, which shows that our measuring tool is working appropriately. We also look at the dielectric loss as a function of frequency, and we see that our experimental data pretty much agrees with our literature published data. So based on this, we also look at the dielectric measurements of bulk NaCl brine solutions at a temperature of 21 plus or minus 1 degree Celsius. We see for the various concentrations of brine, we see the relative permittivity as a function of frequency and the dielectric loss as a function of frequency. Now, looking at the relative permittivity as a function of frequency, you would see that there is not much of a dispersion that is being shown for the various concentrations of brine. And this could be related to the reason why the Collab method fails under some certain conditions. Meanwhile, when you look at the dielectric loss as a function of frequency, you would see that there is a great deal of dispersion for the various brine concentrations considered. So based on this, we can go ahead to use this dielectric loss measurements, which we've shown earlier, to be a function of conductivity in order to infer what our salinity could be. So on this slide, I show you what an example of a bad signal looks like on our dielectric loss measurements on a sample, and what a good signal looks like on a fresh cut preserved sample. You see that a good signal shows before polishing and after polishing shows a good exponential decline for the dielectric loss as a function of frequency, and then the magnitude of the dielectric loss is pretty much higher compared to the one for the bad signal. So this is our QA/QC in order to be sure that the data we are collecting is good enough. So Based on this, I then introduce the loss ratio method, which is our newly developed methodology for salinity determination. So what is this loss ratio method? It's actually a ratio of the dielectric loss at two different frequencies. And so we see salinity as a function of this of the loss ratio for NaCl bulk brine solutions and for KCl bulk brine solutions. We pretty much see that they pretty much agree with each other. And we see that even just for a salinity range of 20,000 ppm to 160,000 ppm, we have quite a vast and dynamic range of the loss ratio. And then based on this, we can go ahead to use this to use this calibration line at different temperatures to kind of like infer probably what the salinity would be in the subsurface. And here we see the salinity as a function of loss ratio at 20 degrees Celsius, 30 degrees Celsius, all the way to 60 degrees Celsius. So depending on the temperature, you can infer what the salinity would be based on knowing the loss ratio. So based on this, we then went ahead to do this, use this developed methodology on different samples that had been saturated in brine of known concentrations for about 6 months. And these samples go across a wide clay content range from like 11% to as high as 35%, and a porosity range from as low as 3% to as high as 18% for the various samples. On this chart, we see the predicted salinity, which is compared with the actual salinity. The predicted salinity is what we get from our loss ratio measurements, and the actual salinity is the salinity of the brine concentration that we saturated our samples with. Now, here's our one-to-one line. We see for our various samples that they fall pretty much on the one-to-one line or close to it. Looking at our Wolfgang shales that covered a range of 20,000 to 80,000 ppm, we also see that they fall close to our one-to-one line. And for our Meramex samples, the various ones that were imbibed or saturated rather in 25,000 ppm, we see that they fall pretty much on the one-to-one line. So that kind of helps us validate that, okay, this seems to be a really good method in predicting salinity. So to use this in other cases, we then go ahead to make measurements on preserved rock samples. And so still using this same method, we show you here how the preserved rock sample is placed directly under the probe. And then we showed here the typical measurement configuration, showing the various measurement locations that we can measure the sample. The minimum sample diameter for this method is a 1 inch sample diameter, and we can use up to as high as like 4-inch sample diameter. Now, in this chart, we do, in this slide, we do these measurements on preserved Eagle Ford samples coming from the same formation, but they were separated between 50 feet depth. We pretty much see here that they have comparable petrophysical parameters, as we see the TOC is close to each other, and then we see like the carbonates and quartz and feldspar contents are close to each other. Now we see that for the various measurements that were done on these various samples, we pretty much see that we're able to predict that the salinity for this E1 sample was 48,000 plus or minus 4,000 ppm, and for the E2 sample was 47,000 plus or minus 1,000 ppm. So due to the fact that these two samples were gotten from the same formation, but they were just separated by 50 feet, we can see that we see pretty much good comparison between the salinity predictions for the two different samples. So this kind of shows a good confidence in our newly developed methodology. So this leads to the conclusion of this presentation. We've been able to see that the loss ratio method can quantify salinity in porous media within 10% of the true values for a salinity range of 20 to 160,000 ppm. We also see that the loss ratio method can be used on rock samples to identify zones of native saturation. And then based on this, we can then use this method in combination with our dielectric laws to determine in situ salinity at reservoir temperature. So here is some references for that I used in creating this presentation, and thank you, and I'm open for any questions that you may have.
All right, thank you so much, Judah, for sharing your work during the ISPC competition last year. Really appreciate that. So we open the floor for questions. So if you have any questions, you can type in your questions, or you can either raise your hand. So I saw one question from Jorge Costa Gomez. Jorge, do you want to ask questions by yourself, or I can read it for you? All right, let me read it for you. Thank you for the interesting talk. If I understood correctly, your lab tested pure and acid natrium chloride saturated water. Can you use this method for other dissolved salt content, let's say for Ca, Mg, Fe, or any other salt?
Yes, thank you for that question. Yes, you can use this method for other salts. I would just advise that like a calibration curve be developed for the other salts that you're interested in. For this study, I did not consider other salts to see if the same trend that we noticed for the NaCl and KCl will be noticed for other salts. So like, would they also fall along the same line such that you can use the same calibration equation for other salts? So that was not explored in this project, but definitely can be explored. And it will be important like to build a calibration curve for other salts, and then based on maybe prior knowledge as regarding the produced water constituents in the particular formation that you are dealing with, you can then use the appropriate calibration curve to predict what the salinity could be.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. Any other questions? I see one hand raised. Oh, okay. Okay, let me try again. But I see one hand raised. Michael, you would like to ask questions? All right, maybe he's still mute. Okay, we have following questions from, there was a core method for determining salinity by grinding the samples and use distilled water. Are you familiar with this method? The question coming from William Donovan.
By grinding the samples and using distilled water?
Yeah.
I think, yeah, that particular method, I showed it in the introductory slides. That is like the salt leaching method, where you use the DI water to take out like the ions that might have been inside the dried rock samples. Like I showed earlier, the limitation that method presents is that you actually need to like do some calculations, like back calculate what the salinity would be, but you have to have an idea of like what is the porosity and what is the saturation of those samples in order to be able to make that effective calculation of what is the salinity. And usually that's like a worry area, because you kind of like use the salinity in order to determine, you use the salinity or resistivity values in order to determine what saturation would be. So except you have like a strong confidence of your porosity and saturation values, that could be when you could use maybe that salt leaching method.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much for that. The next questions from Daniela Navarro. Very interesting talk. Can you apply this with the well logs as input? For example, you use deep resistivity as the input.
I believe, yes, I know that this method can be applied into dielectric logs, provided like the frequencies that were used in this study are that the particular tool that is being used actually takes into consideration these frequencies. And so one of the reasons why like I developed like the variation of this with regards to temperature is to see how it could be applicable to dielectric logs, like in the subsurface, like based on the temperature in the subsurface, using the calibration curve at the various temperatures. You can actually use this for dielectric logs. So it's one of the things we're trying to do in our research group, like to actually get dielectric logs and like actually use this newly developed method, but we have not been privy to like getting dielectric logs. So it's another like area of research that we are really interested in exploring.
Awesome, thank you. We have another questions from Suji Liu. What sample would be suitable for this salinity measurement?
It would be suitable for different measurements. Like as seen here, we saw that the porosity was even covered like a range as low as 3%, so as high as 18%, and we also see like the clay content range was as high as 35%. So I would say like this method is applicable for different for a wide variety of samples. The only issue that that could arise is due to the fact that this is like a sort of like electrical measurement, and so samples that have like highly conductive minerals like pyrite in them may not be suitable for this methodology.
Okay, all right. Yes, hope it answer. So yeah, I don't see any more questions from my side, but this have been a very excellent our first student webinar. So I think with that, I will conclude the webinar for today. If you miss to see the webinar from beginning, we plan to put the recorded version in the YouTube channel, SPWLA YouTube channel. So yeah, you can still try to play the recording later on. So with that, Judah, Odiachi, thank you so much for sharing your great work with SPWLA members, with our students, and thank you so much for being a very great example. In my opinion, it's just wonderful. So thank you everyone for attending this first webinar, and let's keep supporting our students and then have a great rest of the day. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Siska. Thank you very much, SPWLA. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Katerina, you want to have something to say?
No, thank you all, and excellent job, Judah. Thank you.
Yeah,
it's a hard one to beat. Hard one to beat, Judah. You set the bar high.
And yeah, FYI, he is now also the OU representation for 2022. So yeah.
Wonderful.
We'll have a very great. Oh, we have one more questions.
It's more of a comment.
Yeah, well, comment actually, yeah. Awesome. Yes.
Travis is saying, I can see the utility of the estimation of salinity to reduce uncertainty of other saturation parameters. So yeah, that's why we have smart students. Keep on dialing in for those webinars. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah, bye-bye for now.
Have a great one. Take care.
Rest of the day.
Bye.
Bye.